So this meeting is probably past due, given that the engineers who are working on the Threat Insights team are all new to the company. I know there's been informal knowledge sharing between the people who developed the initial vulnerabilities and findings within GitLab, but we haven't actually had any kind of a organized meeting outside of our weekly group calls. So this came up in our retrospective. It's come up several times in the past. Apologies for taking so long to get this on the calendar. We've got on our agenda that people have put questions in advance, so we'll just jump right into that. We can also decide at the end of this call if this should be something that we do again, whether it's recurring or just on demand, but we'll see how that goes today. This is part of a larger effort. Thank you, Olivier, for creating the knowledge sharing issue that Tiago and I are driving. So I think in addition to these types of conversations, we need to also look at our engineering focused documentation and any other supporting resources that the engineers who are working on vulnerability management can use to understand some of the reasons decisions were made in the past and domain information that's held by a lot of the folks on this call. So I'll be quiet now. And Alexander, you've got the first item on the agenda. I'll go ahead and share the agenda for the sake of everyone looking at the same thing.
Cool. Yeah, so my question was around the pipeline security tab and why every time someone accidentally calls it a dashboard, they get banished. And Matt and Lucas and Andy all chimed in to say that it's more of a report, it's a list, and Lucas says that they're unpersisted report data. Lucas, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I guess the dead horse I'll probably continue to beat in this meeting is that there's a fundamental difference between findings, which are occurrences, and vulnerabilities. So when something appears in a merge request and it hasn't been merged into the default branch, it has the potential to be a vulnerability, but it is not yet a vulnerability. We're a bit more vague with our wording in the UI for that, but we don't actually persist something to the database until it's merged into the default branch. And that idea is that you don't actually have a vulnerability in your application until it's been merged. So that's like the real difference between occurrences, which are now called findings, and vulnerabilities. And so when you're looking at a pipeline, the pipeline is rendered out of the report attached to the report attached to an artifact, which is just JSON objects. It's not actually pulling from the database.
Cool. And all the backend people here probably know the answer to this already. But if the findings in the pipeline security tab are not stored in the database, where are they stored? You said they're just JSON objects on the report, or where is that stored?
Yeah, so the 20-second flow is the security scanner runs in the pipeline. It generates a JSON artifact, which gets uploaded to the Rails app. At the end of the pipeline run, we have a background worker that takes that JSON file, iterates through it, and persists these things into the vulnerability occurrences table, which also creates the vulnerabilities in the vulnerabilities table. So the data from the pipeline is just showing the data straight out of the JSON report. Olivier has a good point, though, that if it is on the default branch, it could show it from the database instead, because we try and reduce the risk of unsynchronized data. Does that make sense?
No, because you just said that it creates the JSON report that then stores in the vulnerability occurrences table, but that's in the database.
So the JSON report, each vulnerability in the JSON report will get saved as a record in the vulnerability occurrences table when the merge request gets merged into the default branch. And only then.
Right.
I have a question and also clarification. So the thing is, we are only creating the entries in the database if the this artifact is related to default branch. So we are not actually creating the occurrences based on the JSON blob. of the previous pipeline, but we are running it again with the default branch and then saving it again, saving it to the database accordingly. So my question is, do we have a retention period for these JSON files? Like, are we deleting them at some point? Okay, what is the retention period? Do we know it?
Olivier might know this off the top of his. Okay, no, he doesn't. Cool.
No,
Well,
it depends.
I mean, I can,
yeah.
like,
this
you
is
can
a
answer
setting.
it later.
This is setting on GitLab, an instance-wide setting on GitLab.com. I think 30 days by default. So it could be 30 days there unless you are specifying this specifically. You kind of write that value into the job definition, or maybe with an environment variable too. This has to be checked, but yeah, basically this is an issue for multiple edge cases.
Also, this snippet that Olivier posted is dope. Thank you.
Yeah, I put that like long times ago in the Threads Insight channel, but well, you probably got overwhelmed with tons of other things. And this might not be 100% accurate because this is quite old, but this is explaining the main differences between these two workflows. And this was both interesting for engineering, but also for UX and product, because this was the main approach we had in Secure to distinguish between the two main personas, the developer workflow and the security analyst workflows. So basically what was happening to the default branch is what's impacting your live application. These are existing real threats. And this is what is mostly called vulnerability. Whereas what is happening on the feature branches and showing in pipeline views and merge requests are potential vulnerabilities. So they are not yet impacting your real application. And from the engineer perspective, as Lucas said, on one side, this is just parsing the reports, creating plain Ruby objects, entities, and sending them to the front end with serializers. And the other side, you have a service running at the end of the pipeline, getting this parsing against the JSON file and sending them into the database. And on top of that, we added the first class vulnerability, which is now what is displayed in the dashboard. Initially, the dashboard, we're using the findings from the database. And yeah, the small gotcha is with pipeline view. It's a bit hybrid because if you're looking at the feature branch, it will parse the JSON reports. If you're looking at the default branch, it will get that data from the database. And we have a class that transform, I don't know which way it is. If we transform a plain Ruby object into, I think it's okay, we transform a plain Ruby object into an active record instance, but we don't persist it, we just instantiate them and then send them to the serializer to show that for pipeline use and merge request use on feature branches. But this allows us to have the same serializer stack for every finding, whether it comes from the database or from the JSON artifacts.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you for posting again. I got it this time. And I am content with my question. So if anybody, unless anyone else has any other questions regarding it, Miho, you're up.
Not much as a question, but I was wondering because at some point I was trying to get a clearer picture of what database table does what. And as you can see, there were several iterations of the database model, with the latest one being posted on, I think there's a comment down below with a link to even and more up-to-date database model. So I was wondering if we could like have some, if we do have some, like maybe not a handbook page, but some kind of documentation page where we could actually like store a high-level overview, technical overview for the developers.
And kind of in a larger question, outside of product documentation, where do we store that type of engineering focused documentation?
I have no clue.
This is the main issue. It's been a long time we're discussing that in Secure too, and yeah, we don't know yet what's the best place. The user documentation might not be the best place because it's too much for engineers, for users. But a lot of things that we are now trying to expose to our own engineers also makes sense for third-party integrators. So we might have multiple places to put that kind of information. Maybe if it's too internal, it doesn't make sense to put it there, but I think the workflow might be interesting to put into user documentation. Some of the behavior of the, I mean, the main entities of the architecture makes sense from an integrator perspective so that they understand better how we display the data that I push into the JSON reports. But for very internal technical documentation, it's not yet clear and still an issue for us too.
Are there potentially README files that are very close to the database where it would make sense to store this? It feels keeping it close to the code is always beneficial.
Yeah, I think a README file would be a good idea at the beginning, but I am wondering if this will not be much more complicated, and I think we will require multiple files. So I was wondering if we could like start thinking about creating something like an internal engineering handbook or something like that, where every stage could place their own documentation, which I imagine would mostly have like high-level overview of how things work together.
It would help community. Sorry, go ahead.
I just think that the biggest barrier to that, or the biggest issue that we have, is documentation gets outdated almost immediately, which is why all the things we're referencing are outdated. So I don't think it would be a good idea if we did this without figuring out a way of doing it to auto-generate, likely from an ERD or something of that nature. Like starting with the secure terminology glossary, I think is a huge step there in getting at least everyone on the same page. But figuring out some way of auto-generating that would be the most effective, I think. There is actually also the, I'm following the architectural evolution work that people have been working on as well, and I'll try and link that here. But I know that at least the Verify team has started documenting ways of setting up an architecture, which might be something worth exploring.
Cool. This sounds like something that we should follow up on, but not spend too much time on this call. And it's a question that the security team has been asking, it sounds like, for a bit. The auto-generate, I mean, this really applies to database schemas more than anything, right?
Yeah, the database schema can be auto-generated, but I think that a high-level overview of what is plugged into what and what the workflow is from the developer's perspective.
And that piece doesn't change as frequently, correct?
Yes, I don't think the high-level overview will change. I think the code will change. As Lucas said, this is going to change very often, so it's going to get out of date very often. But I wouldn't say that the high-level overview of the future will change that often, unless we say, okay, we're scratching the whole thing and doing it from scratch. But yeah, I don't think that's going to happen at any point.
Okay, I know we have an issue open around improving our technical documentation for vulnerability management, and I think adding to that would be the right thing to do for this, Michał. As far as
I think that it would be a good place. Basically, the problem I see happening every now and on is the issue links model. We have a model that's called vulnerability issue links, and it was created at the early stage of the implementation when we still were not doing the MVC, and it was supposed to be a cornerstone of multiple vulnerabilities per issue. And we are not using it at all currently with the current implementation. And this pops every now and so often with the maintainers asking or reviewers asking, why is this model here? What is the model doing there? And I have to find the exact issue where I think Ross said that we should leverage this. But we decided not to leverage this at this early implementation of standalone vulnerabilities. And this is
you just skipped an agenda item, Michał. We can come back to number 4. I think you jumped into number 5, which is totally fine.
Oh yeah, sorry. It was what Mehmet wrote down. Okay.
So if you want to, we can come back to your number 4 item, Michał.
No. I think it should be merged into item number 3.
Okay. So this is all about the documentation and keeping that up to date. All right. So let's get into this one-to-many, one-to-one relationship topic. I know this has come up a number of times. So Mehmet?
So basically, we just want to understand what was the rationale behind designing it in this way. One vulnerability can have more than one occurrence or finding. Actually, after reading the answer from Lucas, what's written here, It kind of makes sense. Do you want to verbalize it, Lucas?
Sure. So we talked a lot about aggregation early on, and Andy can definitely speak more to this. But if you think about the two different models, so we have the occurrences table, which is created straight out of our analyzer data. So it's essentially stateless data. It's an artifact of the location and just the raw data of what is found via our analyzers. The vulnerability table is stateful. So the idea is that with a vulnerability, that if you run a analyzer and code gets merged, then the finding is no longer present in your code. But just because something has been merged, it may not have been deployed to production yet. So you might want to manually resolve your vulnerability, but the finding is no longer there. So a vulnerability can be stateful. It can have things like an assignee in theory, or if you want to give it a clearer title, you can, but the underlying finding data should not be modified. So that's that separation there. And in the case of something like a vulnerability that SAS picks up that gets exploited by DAST, that will create two separate occurrence records or findings. But in theory, that should really be the same vulnerability. It's the same piece of code you're going to be modifying to resolve. It's the same piece of code that you'd be assigning out or triaging. So that's the idea behind having multiple.
So we are using the project fingerprint to identify if they are the identical things, right? I mean, if the occurrences are identical, right?
Yes, but that's very specific, because the fingerprint, well, so the fingerprint is a composite of a couple things, and one of those things is the report type. So it should have the same identity if it is a SAS vulnerability that has moved. Currently, there's an issue with that because we don't track line number changes, but a DAST occurrence of the vulnerability and a SAST occurrence will never have the same fingerprint. They're technically two different things. They're going to have different metadata attached to them, but they inherently are the same flaw, and they would be fixed with a single line of code change.
Okay.
Please also be careful with the project fingerprint, because this is a legacy way to compare things. It's not accurate. It's not reliable over time. We have an open issue to move to a more stable way, like comparing findings in a stateful way, like when we're storing a finding in the database and then having a new pipeline comparing if it's an existing one. We don't use a project fingerprint. We use the report type, the location fingerprint, and the primary identifier, because those are supposed to be stable data, except if the location change, and then we have an issue to improve the tracking. But the project fingerprint is a legacy property that we generate from the analyzer side. That is a compound that, like I said, about multiple properties, but it's not done consistently between the different analyzers. And we have no proof yet that the third party will follow that. So instead, we want to generate that consistent way of identifying a finding on the right side by leveraging those three information, which we also call like the coordinates, which is mainly the location fingerprint and the primary identifier. The report type is one of them, but it's more about the unicity constraint in the database. But the difficulties for you in the vulnerability management part is how the different grouping capabilities that you can add to the first class vulnerability, because there can be multiple interests into grouping. It could be like a workaround around the fact that we are not able to correctly track findings over time. So we will just pop up multiple findings to the UI, but it's actually the same one. But well, there is no way we can merge them together. So it's up to the user to group them constantly to the same vulnerability, which is painful, but it's the best workaround we have today. But you can also try to group multiple findings that are from the same primary identifier. Like if it's the same CVE and you want all of those findings of the same CVE being addressed at the same time. So this is a challenge differently for you, Matt, and the UX team, because, well, you have a ton of different things to consider. But yeah, one of the big interests that for us from the engineering perspective, at least, was to go over this instability of the finding, which was painful to deal with the user when we want to add time-related data, like from when did this finding has been introduced into your application. if we cannot recognize that finding over time, then we cannot add like SLAs on top of this kind of information because the tracking is not reliable.
So I think this is a really good insight. So you were saying like, since these occurrences are based on the location, primary identifier and the report type composition, like this is the identifier of an occurrence. At some point, as you said, like you can't really understand like if the occurrences are identical, if the line has been changed. So this has to be done manually by the user. So seems like in the near future, we have to find a way to merge vulnerabilities together to represent just like one vulnerability. Okay.
Yeah, I would actually say that's regardless, or that's orthogonal to this issue. I think it's just, it's going to be important to do that regardless, but it definitely would solve this, yeah.
Okay. Yep, thanks for the answer.
So before we move on, I think it's up in B or A, you can't see it on the screen. The epic that Jonathan linked, it's definitely, I think, Lucas, this is what you were talking about. It is related, but I guess what I want us to make sure that I'm not overstepping here. This exploration was intended less around, I think it's pretty clear cut that we need to have a roll up of findings into sort of single containers. My concern is more about opening up things like linking any sort of, the vulnerabilities or potentially even the occurrences to one issue versus multiple issues versus one MR versus multiple MRs. There are certain things that if we go one to many or many to one now, we don't know if that's I guess a good way to work, if it's a preferred way to work. I think there's a lot of usability research that's missing. That's what Andy and Tali on our UX research team are trying to do right now, is have a little bit more informed perspective. There's also other kind of complications that if you look at a lot of the competitive tools out there, they even have a third layer. So they consider, let's say an instance is one specific time that a vulnerability, let's say, occurred, was identified in a file. If a particular SAS scan finds the same CVE 10 times in one file, they would say that that was 10 instances. Now, the application itself, that counts as one occurrence, or there's other terms they use for that, but basically the application contained that CVE. So then if you're looking broadly across multiple applications, the number of occurrences is the number of apps vulnerable to that CVE. Does that make sense? So there's that kind of, it's a 3-tier hierarchy. So this is why I'm a little bit hesitant to push forward with some of these decisions right now, because I get that it's a lot of re-architecture. And I don't want to do it and then have to redo it or make it a change that we're going to regret later. So that's why I'm sort of advocating caution right now until we have a little more data.
I think that makes complete sense. And since I commented or emojied onto that epic without leaving a comment, I think I think what you said makes a ton of sense. And I think that this really needs to be broken apart, because discussing findings versus vulnerabilities and then issues and merge requests and a third object, those are all so vastly different topics that I really don't think that we can continue that in the same thread. Previously, we were talking about things like attaching issues directly to findings, which is currently possible using the vulnerability feedback object. And then the idea of a vulnerability would be an aggregation of the issues attached to its findings. So there'd still be like a one-to-one relationship there, but there's kind of like that cascading idea that we explored before as well. I think that's definitely worth exploring more. I just think it definitely needs to be prioritized differently than something like the issues, merge requests, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I think based on the discussion that's been going around in that particular issue, I'm almost inclined to sort of close it. It was me not knowing a whole lot about GitLab or the history of the project or a lot of this. So old me was writing something down and not really understanding it. And I agree, it's not really actionable. It's too open-ended and it contains too many things. all that is to say, the whole discussion around do we need a way to aggregate up all these independent findings into a single vulnerability object? Absolutely. I think we just need a little bit more detail on how to approach that. But that's something we know today is a challenge for users. They want to be able to, if it's the same CVE, they want to see it all in one place. They don't want to action it 5 times or 500 times, depending on what it was.
I appreciate the distinction you made about these 3 different layers. Is it clear to everyone here what is currently our architecture in terms of how we use those layers today? Like, what is really important is you said there are multiple instances, but they just can add one vulnerability into the application. Right now, this kind of things which are shown on the dashboard is based on that. Like, we want to report each individual findings separately if they are all in different lines of code, because there are, if you have 10 occurrences, 10 instances of the same file, this is 10 entry points for security vulnerabilities. So this is why we want to report a number of 10 in the dashboard controls, for example. At least this is what the intent so far. But I know this is challenging for DAS because DAS can come with a tons of URLs for the exact same threads, which is painful to then have a tons of findings. But this is how we're doing things today.
And I guess on one more word on terminology too, because it's not really captured here. If this might already be understood, but just to touch on why we keep jumping in between the word occurrence and finding. Occurrence, just, we want to move away from occurrence because occurrence has a sense of finality to it. You're saying there is an occurrence of this thing. And when we go back to the idea of a merge request having the potential for being exploitable, then findings seem to be more indicative of that potential. Occurrence, we don't want to imply that there is an occurrence of vulnerability in your code base just because it's in a merge request branch.
I think
So
so.
they mean the same thing.
That's a great point. And I think there was a lot of that in Alexander's question as well. So Andy and I are making terminology definitions part of the research. We want to find out, what do people that actually deal with this stuff call it? Because interestingly enough, from a security perspective, we've heard some engineers say, if it's not in the code base that I care about yet, I don't care what you call it. It's just a defect. It's a flaw. It's a coding error. It will introduce a vulnerability, but I would expect it fixed just like any other deficiency found during, you know, the sort of the pre-deploy process. So that's a big part of this. And because again, if we're confused, I'm sure our users are confused. And we'll put all this in that technical documentation once we figure out a place for it.
I think this glossary that Olivier linked to here should contain that information already.
Yeah, but we might consider a follow-up because this merge request has gone through and particularly due to my fault in terms of back and forth. And big thanks to Cameron for holding this merge request, by the way. So, but yeah, this is definitely a good place to improve if you think that the current definition are not complete or ambiguous.
All right, Mehmet, you got the next one also.
Yeah, the next one is about actually like in one of the upcoming issue designs, I have seen that there's a model box to mark finding as dismissed in the findings panel of merge requests. But the thing is, like, since we are not storing those findings in the database, they are just in the like JSON file. Like, seems like there is no way to do this. Like, the only thing that I can come up with is just like creating UIDs with the seed value. So if we can use the identifiers that we already discussed previously, the location, the report type, and the other thing, we can actually create the same UID always for the same occurrence or for finding, just to be politically correct. So is it like a viable plan to you, or like what do you think? Should we actually store them in the database?
let me interject here. I think you can already do this, Mehmet. I mean, if you open a merge request and the pipeline finishes, and you go to the security widget on the merge request, you can dismiss. Okay. I think I know what's the problem. If you go to the merge request and you go to the security widget, it shows findings, and you can mark the finding as dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
If you end up merging that merge request and the finding is marked as dismissed, then the vulnerability that will be created from this finding will be also marked as resolved or dismissed, or whatever the status name is
Mm-hmm.
for the vulnerability.
Is it the current state? Because I don't know. Like I'm not familiar with that
Sure
widget.
I have implemented it myself, so I think it
Okay.
works.
Okay, then this question is irrelevant.
Well, actually, let me confirm that later. But I think this is already working.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. Go ahead.
You bring up a good point where eventually in the merge request, we're going to have to treat the experience differently because it's geared towards maintainers and developers, not AppSec. But if we bring AppSec into it as well, there are going to be different states for vulnerabilities like allowed or ignore. And those stateful things will still have to persist into the security dashboard so that we can keep record of it. And then there's another instance where we may want to filter by branch in the security dashboard as well. That's come up before. So that might change or help direct the conversation.
Olivia, I think you're responding to this. Would you mind vocalizing that?
Yeah, so this is actually what the project fingerprint is made for. We wanted to make sure that when you're providing feedback, whether it is about dismissing, creating an issue, or creating a merge request on the finding, whether it's based on the finding that you get from a JSON report on a pipeline view or a merge request, or from one stored in the database that you can see, that you could see before on the dashboard, you can retrieve that feedback in the other location. So if you create a merge request, there is a finding here, and you dismiss it because you don't think it's relevant. Once you merge this merge request, the pipeline running at the default branch will find that finding again because it still exists in the code, but you say you dismissed it in the merge request. So we don't want this to pop it back into the default branch and show on your dashboard. So the feedback is based on the project fingerprint, which is generated by the analyzer. So this information is always kept with the finding. So when you pop the report on the default branch, you store that in the database. Then when it's displaying the dashboard, you can fetch all the fingerprints, the feedback, for that project. And you take all the project fingerprint, you compare that with the project fingerprint of the finding that you have, and you can match them and apply this feedback directly. So you can quickly see if there is an issue, a merge request, or a dismissal applied to the finding that you have in the database. Obviously, this is working as long as the project fingerprint stays stable between the merge request and after you merge that in the default branch, which is why there is an issue to migrate and move away from this legacy project fingerprint to use the more reliable approach of having the report type, primary identifier, and location fingerprint as a way to match those things.
Okay.
So our last agenda item is from Jonathan, and he's not here. Matt, would you want to speak to this since you've already replied to it?
Yeah, sure. So Jonathan had pointed to I believe that was sort of the original top level issue for first class vulnerabilities. It was a backend ticket. It calls out a whole bunch of other cases, basically, of where first class vulnerabilities could come from. So I can't specifically speak to what previous PM thought about this, but I believe what the intent is what the goal is still kind of long-term. So vulnerabilities today really only come from our internal scanners, but that's not the only place that a vulnerability might be identified. You're going to have internal testing, you might have third-party pen testers, you have bug bounty programs, like GitLab uses HackerOne. So all of this is potential ways that we want to make an awareness of the vulnerability inside of the system. And I think what's underlies all these is we just need a way to manually create a vulnerability and tie it. Now, it may not look exactly like the vulnerabilities for the scanners and tie that into the same workflow, but under the covers, we need to have similar definitions. So we'll need to have things like description, title, if there has been a CVE added to it. So like things that come in through HackerOne, if it turns out to need a CVE, we can attach it internally, standardizing severity. So yes, I think this is actually in the viable plan. I've linked the issue there. And it's kind of a key piece of moving more from where we are today, which is we have really a severity-based workflow because that's all we're giving people. It's what is the classification of this vulnerability? What we need to get to for much broader adoption, especially in larger enterprises, is a risk-based model so that they can actually have more understanding of the context of a particular vulnerability. You know, it may say it's a critical severity, but if it's in an internal only, never hit production facing system, they may not consider that as risky to let something through as, let's say, a medium or an unknown in the production system. So this is going to be part of it. And the reason why you can kind of see it's the epic it's tied to is looking at CVSS v3 as a way to standardize that. Is we need to let people classify these things manually in a common language. And I was going to say, rest of the secure engineering team, jump on me when this is wrong. I believe a lot of the scanners that we use today do have the ability to provide CVSS scores. It may not be quite the same version, it may not be 3.1, but I know we are not exposing it in the JSON today. That's not part of the reporting artifact, so that'll be something we'll need to consider as well. But ultimately, we need a common language for severity, and CVSS is kind of the big game in town for that.
You will face an issue then because some of the analyzers don't rely on that, and it would be hard then to do this. I mean, this cannot be a mandatory information. This will just be an additional one.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and there are going to be other things as well, like especially on the fuzzers, depending on what they're doing. There's no way they're going to be able to come up with a CVSS score for that, so we will have to make things like that optional. But we're hoping we can use some neat things like the CVSS calculator, where we've turned it into a form that the user is basically filling in the right information. We can use that to help generate a severity for them.
Yeah, it might be worth looking into an NVD, their feed, and importing or connecting to, they have like a JSON data feed that will bring in CWE for the associated CVE, and it could bring in CVSS score if there's one associated with it.
That's a great idea. You might discuss about this with the vulnerability research team because they already are doing a lot of matching work with the NVD database for dependency scanning, because this is one of our main vulnerability database, and they are doing some matching with CPs, but they could do something similar with the CVSS scores, so that if you have a CVE identified for a SaaS vulnerability, you could retrieve the CVSS score from that. That would be great. Yeah, great idea.
So we've reached the end of our agenda. We have 10 minutes left. Are there any items that didn't get added to the agenda that anyone wants to ask about now? Okay, so go ahead.
Lindsay, actually, just one more just came to my mind because like I was reviewing the MR from Ellen today. Recently, we had an issue like in one of the reports, we were having some findings without scanners. So since like this information is coming from the secure team, like how do we guarantee that, like how do we guarantee the scheme of the report? Because like this is breaking the parts that we are implementing at the moment, but we don't really know like what is required, what is optional, like how do we guarantee that? No way. Okay.
Cass, you want to go ahead?
So we have a JSON report schema that tells which fields are required now. The biggest issue is around legacy data. Namely, we don't currently differentiate between, I opened like 7 issues about this recently, so let me just find these. But we don't currently differentiate between different reports versions. There is a version attached to reports, but we don't actually validate that version and have a minimum version set.
Mm-hmm.
So let me paste some relevant issues to that. Please enjoy the pretty colors. But yeah, so we have a lot of issues around this, documenting a version compatibility matrix, because currently we have full compatibility theoretically. The primary reason that this breaks is if you're uploading a really old report. The reason this isn't normally an issue, except in our testing, is because the parsing of the JSON report is almost simultaneous with the generation of the report. There isn't really a common use case where someone would actually download a report artifact, wait, and then later upload it back into the Rails app. That's just something we do to speed testing along. So it's pretty rare for there actually to be a discrepancy between an analyzer generating an old report and the Rails app uploading it. The only time that happens is if you pin to an old version of the analyzers, because we changed something that broke your workflow, which is still a valid reason. So we have lots of, we need to generate a compatibility matrix for that. But generally, it's not as big of an issue as you would think.
Although, Lucas, would that affect third-party integrators? So we have WhiteSource is currently our official, or one of our official partners on that. Are you saying if they continue to input, let's say we're on 2.4, but they're sending in 2.0, that potentially that's going to break for them?
Only if we, yeah. So there's another issue here, which is on pinning to the minor version of our tools. So here is issue E. But I guess I would say that this one is kind of tangential, but it really depends on how they do their version pinning. So if they actually release new versions in a similar way to we do, which basically means we release all of our analyzers as Docker image tag 2, and anytime we make an update, we retag image 2, then that will continue to work, but there is definitely more potential for third-party integrators to break. I don't think that we have any guidelines on such tools right now, but that would be good to document. Is there anything you'd like to add, Olivier?
Yeah. I think the main issue here for vulnerability management team is to deal with the discrepancies between what the schema is saying and what the Rails application is supposed to support. And this was a discussion we had in the recent brainstorming session in Secure. To clarify a bit this, it was regarding the addition of the vendor property, I think. And it's everything that you're adding to the report should be considered optional from the Rails perspective. Like in the report schema, we add a new property and we say, starting from this version, this should be a required field, because we assume that any vendor, any third party, and any GitLab analyzer outputting this version of the schema should absolutely provide this property. But on the Rails side, you still need to be backward compatible with until 3 major release back, which is a ton of different versions probably. So this is the main guideline, but usually it means you should be backward compatible. So even if the report that you get is saying that this field is required, the Rails side should consider this as optional, because you still support other versions of the report that don't provide that information. Depending on the use case, this can be addressed differently. Like for example, if you can provide a default value, well, you can consider this a required field, and the parser for the older version of the report will provide the default value instead. But this is the kind of thing that you need to keep in mind when adding new things to the report schema. And this has to be documented, but to be honest, we just went through that discussion like this week or last week, I don't remember. So part of the architecture documentation effort.
All right. So I'm going to share this recording. I'll leave this agenda open. And if there are more questions added that can't be answered asynchronously, we can decide if we want to set up another meeting like this. So I really appreciate everybody's time. We do have 4 more minutes. If anyone has any more questions, there's still time.
Do we want to set up an action item to make sure we finally put that somewhere? Because this is a recurring, insecurity has been a recurring topic. Yeah, we need to document, we need to document. And it's been more than a year that, well, nothing much has been documented. So I think it would be great to have this as an action item in DRI.
So we do have an issue. So when you say documented, you're talking about the overall sort of life, what we basically a summary of what we just talked about, some more technical documentation around the vulnerability lifespan.
Yeah, like if there is a new vulnerability management team member joining the team and we don't have to go through all that discussion again. And I mean, because
so we do have an issue that was created that I created that is currently in 13.3. The team is already starting to look at it to create that documentation. I would find it in one of these open tabs that I have right now, but I don't want to show that I have open in all my tabs. Sorry. I can share that in this agenda or with this group after the call, and we can work from there. And I believe the DRI on that is Iago, since this is largely a back-end effort.
Yeah, I was just more asking about, do you want the legacy team members that have that knowledge today to write the documentation, or do you prefer the Thread Insight team members writing it and asking for feedback on the legacy secure groups?
We'd written the issue in the latter, under the assumption that the Thread Insight team would be writing that documentation and working with the secure team to ensure that it was correct. I'm kind of looking at Mehmet and Mihao as the 2 folks who would be kind of on the hook for that. Does that sound accurate to you guys?
Yep.
Great.
Perfect then. Thanks.
Awesome. And I'll share that right after the call. All right. Thank you everyone so much for your time. This was really informative. I feel like I learned a lot today personally. So like I said, I'll share the recording, and if there's more questions that come out of it, we'll try and answer them asynchronously. If not, we will find another time to talk.
Thank you for setting this up.
You're welcome. Tthank you everyone for joining. Bye.
Hey.